when I was relating to a minister in Singapore about our approach here, he said, "You really sure, Idris, that you guys disclose the scores of the ministers? Are you really sure that you put inside the report what they've achieved and also what they haven't achieved? Do you really do that?" He said, "Of course we do." He said, so I took my iPad at the time, I carried my iPad, and I went to the website and I showed it to him. He said, "Wow, you know, Idris, you guys in Malaysia have taken this word transparency all the way to the hilt." He said, "Do you know, let me remind you, there is a fine balance between transparency, nakedness, and pornography."
What's your personal biggest public failure? And
Well,
what did you learn? Welcome to the Game of Impossible podcast. My name is Leon. This is my dad, Idris Jala. We are a father-son podcast where we discuss all things transformation through the lens of business, leadership, sport, and faith. Today marks the close of our 8-part series on your 8 steps big fast results methodology. And today we are going to be closing off with the importance of making results of your pursuits public. Dad, what does this look like for PEMANDU Associates? What are some of your best practices?
The best practices is those countries that take it all the way. That means the more transparent you are in publishing the results, the more the organization, the leaders in the organization feel completely accountable. Remember, I mentioned before that you make yourself totally pregnant by announcing your KPIs. But now when you tell them, we're going to publish the actual performance and the scores and what you have delivered and also not delivered in a manner that's so transparent. The more transparent you are, the more you drive the organization to become accountable for delivering results. And we've seen this in the case of Malaysia, actually. In the case of Malaysia, we really went out there to do it. So transparency, make it to the hilt, and making sure it really drives accountability. Actually, Leon, I have a little story. When I was relating to a minister in Singapore about our approach here, he said, "You really sure, Idris, that you guys put out the annual report and publish it? Are you really sure that you disclose the scores of the ministers? Are you really sure that you put inside the report what they've achieved and also what they haven't achieved? Do you really do that?" He said, "Of course we do." He said, so I took my iPad at the time, I carried my iPad, and I went to the website and I showed it to him. He said, "Wow, you know, Idris, you guys in Malaysia have taken this word transparency all the way to the hilt." He said, "Do you know, let me remind you, there is a fine balance between transparency, nakedness, and pornography." To which we both laughed, but he said, it's really laudable. And he said, on reflection, I think because you pushed the transparency to such a level, it must have made it very difficult for people not to deliver. And they made themselves completely accountable. He was the one who came with the conclusion as well. I didn't tell him the reasons why we did it. It dawned on him that's what we did. He said, "We do have KPIs in Singapore, but we do have it written down, but we don't go and publish it. We don't have scores that we make available to the public." But that's what we done. In Oman, they do have the scores as well, and but they don't actually go and put out the full report in Oman with scores out there in public. In Tanzania, under President Kikwete, they came out and put out the report and made it public. And the scores of the ministers were also disclosed in the report. So they also did it. So I think in the main, when I look at countries that have now taken the annual report and published in a manner that's as transparent as it can get, it drives performance up. Now, if you ask me, is this thing that we do here unusual? Not really. In the private sector, if you look at all publicly listed companies, all the annual report is published. And not only are they published, but they have AGM, annual general meeting. They will have to answer to the shareholders for performance or lack of performance. So that's the idea behind it. And that's the reason why the private sector published the report. And you know, in the private sector, before the report is published, they have external validators, auditors that audit it.
Yeah,
externally.
and we have a whole episode on that because that's the previous step.
Correct.
The seventh step
Yeah.
is on external validation.
Absolutely.
So if you're interested, you can go and watch that episode as well. We talk about external validation both from a company standpoint, but also touching on from a personal development standpoint, looking at things like how do we do 360 feedback and things like that.
Absolutely. So that is an idea that is borrowed. That I took it squarely from the private sector and applied it to the government. And the reason why we publish it, make it available, is because the stakeholders for government is the citizens. So if you're really serious about accountability and that you are out there to deliver it, you must be prepared to put it out there. The good, the bad, and ugly, put it out in the annual report. And that's what we do. I think those are classic examples.
How do you present the bad and the ugly in your annual report?
And so the
in
way
the
in which,
government context.
and the way we do it there is that we publish in the annual report 3 chapters, 3 elements to it, segments. The first segment is the original targets in the roadmap. These are the KPIs that we drove to do. And then the second segment is the performance, where we have achieved them, where we have not achieved. So it's very clear. And when you list down these are the KPIs, this is the performance of the ministry and the ministers, where they have achieved and not achieved. And then there's a score for the minister and the civil service. There's a score there. That is the second part of the segment. The third segment is what are you going to do constructively for those areas where it is bad, you have not achieved it, how you're going to improve the performance for next year. So that segment is very important. Without that segment, you will be crucified in the public for non-delivery. Because the reality is this. I told all the ministers when we were discussing this very idea, there were quite a lot of them that resisted the idea. And I told them, look, if any one of you is prepared to go and tell the public that whatever you promise to do, you have achieved it 100%, nobody will believe you. The people will believe you if you say, this is what we set out to do, we've achieved this, but we have not achieved this, and this is what we're going to do to achieve it next year. And if you start to do that, you will begin to improve the trust of the people in the government, because this trust deficit is a big problem. And so if you start to improve that, people will say, yeah, okay, this government is transparent. They are prepared to say they have not achieved this, but they're also quite robust in saying what they're going to do differently to improve the performance. So I think when you start putting the annual report in that fashion, it really will drive performance.
If that's such a common practice and a proven practice in the corporate world, why don't more governments and ministers do that?
The reason is very simple, because if you do that, you make yourself incredibly uncomfortable. Nobody wants to be uncomfortable.
Yeah.
And that's why it is very difficult. It took us a long time to convince the cabinet to do it like that. It required me to convince the Prime Minister, Dato Sri Najib, but he took a strong directive approach to leadership at that time. He said, look, I've decided we will do it. There were resistance, but he said, no, we will do it, because I realized they are more good than bad in doing it. So in life, there's no such thing as cherry picking. Cherry picking only the good, and you discount, you don't want to face the bad side of it. There are pros and cons in doing it, and there are challenges associated with it. And so he said there are a lot more good than bad in doing it, so let's just go and do it. In the annual report, if you really look at it, in the whole time when I was there, 2010, 11, 12, 13, all the way up to 2016, you could see who is the highest performing minister in the 30 ministers in the cabinet by looking at the score. Number one, you can see who is the second, who's the third one, who's number 30. You will tell. But I'm surprised that none of the media actually wrote stories around that. It's interesting.
That is surprising, actually. Those would have made for pretty good stories. I can just imagine, name a certain minister, and at the bottom, at the bottom of the league.
In 6 years when I was there was no reporter that came out and made a story out of that. Very interesting, actually. And it had never been used in Parliament by the opposition to criticize a minister that is not performing based on the KPI. In the 6 years I was there, it's most surprising.
I think that's interesting because it goes back to actually if you're if your true north is very compelling, you will actually get to a point where I think in this case, maybe what has happened is that the true north of what you guys were trying to achieve and did achieve through the NTP, the National Transformation Program, and the Economic Transformation Program, the true north of that and the initiatives of it were so compelling that I think for people to criticize, they would rather go for the initiative or the true north itself or the project itself versus the players within that, like, which in this case would be the key ministers. It's also quite ironic that, as you were explaining why maybe certain people may have resisted that idea, it's interesting that, when you're in politics, I think a large part of the game is a game of optics.
Yeah.
Of course, people, we would all like to believe, and there are many politicians out there who are truly in it for the right reasons, beyond power, beyond just mere influence, but are really in there to serve. But nonetheless, you can't deny the fact that you do have to play this game of optics, lah. And for you to be ranked publicly, if you feel like you are probably not going to be one of the high performing ones, obviously that is not good for optics.
Yeah.
But the interesting thing is actually that also gives you a perfect opportunity to boost your optics.
Yeah.
Boost your optics if you perform well, which you're more likely to do if you are under pressure like that, interestingly.
Yeah.
But also, even if you, maybe I would like to think, even if you maybe didn't do so well, the fact that you were willing to be transparent in the first place, I think that creates a great deal of trust immediately. Regardless of whether or not you succeed, the fact that you were willing to put it out there and be transparent.
Absolutely.
I think it shows good intent.
Very good intent. And the thing is this, Leon, you'll notice in the 6 years I was a minister, I've watched it. A minister that was performing law in 1 year, you will see a change in behavior in the subsequent year. And the guy become a lot more kiasu, driving the ministry and the civil servants in his ministry to deliver the outcomes. I see it immediately the following year as a change in performance. You will see one minister in 1 year is down below, and the subsequent year he's up there. And you will see a huge change in the behavior, how leaders behave. When you make it transparent, they know, as you said, the more you feel name and shame that you're bottom of the league, the more likely the person is going to drive performance to improve. And the beauty here is that it is listed clearly in the report what are the things that are the changes that are going to take place to bring the performance up. So the report is not one of those reports that is non sequitur, but this one is totally sequential. There are consequences associated with it. So the consequences are, these are the areas of weakness, and these are the consequences. These are what we're going to do differently. So the report is fantastic. Driving performance. Let me say, before we get down to driving performance, this is what happens before we publish it. We have a performance appraisal. In this performance appraisal, there are 3 people in the room. The Prime Minister sits there, the individual minister sits here, and I sit there. The 3 people in the room. The minister cannot bring any civil servants, any officers into the room. The presumption is the minister must know what has been happening throughout the year in driving the performance of the organization. It must be in his or her tips. So that's why we want personal accountability. They must know what has happened, what has not happened. And in that discussion, there is a report, a culmination of the weekly dashboard, which we put, and also the endorsed report validated by PwC, externally validated. It's on the table. And there's a technical score. There's a score that is given based on performance. So if you did this is the score. The minister has the liberty to challenge the score. If he or she disagrees with the score, he or she can come out and say, I don't agree with the score. Actually, this is the score, and give the evidence why. Time and again, in my 6 years there, I don't think there's one minister that came out and said, I totally disagree with this score. You know why? Because every week that score is there. It's a running score through the whole year. So nothing comes out as a surprise, because every week the guy sees the score.
Yep.
And if you don't like that score, you would have made interventions throughout the year. And so when we put out the technical score, more or less, that score is accepted because it's technically correct based on facts and it's validated. Normally what happens is the minister says, these are the mitigations. The reason why we didn't do it, that is the reason why we didn't do it because of these mitigating circumstances. The budget was not given to us on time. The resources were not there to do it. There was political, resistance from the public for doing those reforms. So they talk about the mitigation factors, but very seldom did they challenge the score because the score is quite robust. Now, the interesting thing is, we finished the discussion, the score is there, the minister put the mitigation, and then the Prime Minister says, I've heard you now, okay, I will here's some discretion to make adjustment to the score based on the mitigation. So instead of maybe 70%, I will now make it 75% because of the mitigation behind this. So he give him the latitude to make an adjustment to it. Then we discuss the areas of weaknesses where we will not achieve them. In the discussion, there will be concrete steps and agreed areas of priorities. At the end of that meeting, I then write a complete note about the discussion, the summary of what was discussed there, and then I draft a letter that the Prime Minister sent to the Minister to capture the gist of what is there. He will say, Dear Dato Sri Hishamuddin, this is the score that we gave to you, and this I applaud you for the work you've done in this area, and these are areas you didn't achieve it, and we have agreed in our discussion earlier that these are your priorities, and I will be watching you next year and how you're going to deliver this. And at the end of the day, then he will sign the letter and that's sent to the minister. And you can see, this is a very formal thing that we do here. And it makes it very serious. And when that is done, when we finish that, that's the thing that is captured in the annual report. All those are captured in the annual report. So none of the ministers object to the report because it was transparently discussed with the Prime Minister in the one-to-one discussion together with me. So this formal approach of engagement is critical. If you just produce an annual report and put it out there, I think you will have rebellion if you didn't have the performance appraisal on a one-to-one basis, because it was rehearsed. They had the opportunity to argue and present the case to it. But Leon, this takes a lot of time. And if we have 30 ministers, it requires every year at least 30 hours of the Prime Minister's time and my time sitting out there to go and do this. By the way, you may ask me what is my KPI and my score in all this. I'm Mr. Average. So that means the scores of everybody, put it all together, add it all together, divided by the number of ministers, and that's my score. That means any minister that's not performing well, it's going to affect my own score. I can never be the outstanding minister inside there because I will be always Mr. Average. So it's my role is to do whatever my team has to make sure that the performance of the ministers at the bottom half are improved because it affects my score. And so it's actually very uncomfortable to be Mr. Average. You know, I have all my life, I have worked in the private sector. I've had my own score. It's the first time in my corporate life that I became Mr. Average in scores. Because the way in which we did it, it was to affect my behavior and affect the behavior of people in PEMANDU. So that our role is to help the bottom half of the team so that we improve the performance.
But that's the cornerstone of effective leadership, isn't it?
Yeah.
To put the bigger picture and the common good before one's own performance. I think that was a challenge in my leadership journey, in learning to not try to be the star, as it were, but actually to allow other people to shine. So in the case of the NTP, had you have tried to have been, top scorer, you wouldn't be allowing the other ministers to do their thing. And actually the whole success of the ETP and NTP hinged on their ability to score well.
Absolutely.
So that's actually, when you said that was, it's interesting lah. Actually, how can we have this mindset of being the Mr. or Mrs. Average in
For
your,
the sake of the team.
leadership? For the sake of the team, exactly.
Yeah. Because I figured out if I had a score that is based on the architecture of the change process, that means we conduct the lab, I will be measured on the labs, that we follow the 8 step, and I probably would have scored really very high. But if I did that, what will happen is that people would say, well, you did this, you glorified yourself in doing this, and what's the purpose of all this? And I concluded at that time, the wisdom of it was, if I become Mr. Average, the best thing that we'll do is that it drives a change in my behavior and the behavior of people in my team. We really start focusing on the bottom half. Because a lot of people want to just focus on the top half.
Yeah.
But we really have to drive that. So every area of weaknesses, that is the focus of our team. Subsequently, to make sure that we achieve that. But it's a very interesting notion.
You know, we've been talking a bit about, I think it must have been episode 1 or episode 2 of this podcast, and I was sharing with you a recent revelation, a bit of an epiphany for me. Someone who has always been goal-oriented.
Right.
And I read this book called Atomic Habits by James Clear, which I mentioned. And, his whole notion is that we don't rise to the quality of our goals, but we fall to the quality of our systems. And I think in this case, actually, this whole thing is not even really about the annual report.
Yeah.
It's not really about that output.
No.
But it's actually about the habit
Yeah.
of doing that monitoring and doing those kind of smaller smaller reports, the habit of doing that on a weekly or maybe even monthly basis.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because without that discipline, then the chances are your annual report is just going to be just another kind of ceremonious thing that you do at the end of the year, without actually creating an environment for your teams to actually perform.
Yeah.
So going back to that point on maybe why people do well, maybe why some of these ministers then started to change their behavior once their results were publicized. I think the key here is that yes, there's an element where you will naturally perform when you're under pressure, and when you feel a bit shy to be the lowest in the table. But I think what's important to mention here is that you also set the correct environment, system, and rhythm to ensure that actually, we're not just going to shame you, but we're actually going to put things in place to ensure that you are more likely to actually succeed in what you're going to do. So in the end, your results being publicized will hopefully become more of a boon than a bane for you.
Let me mention what happened to the annual report when we publish it. We have a session where the Prime Minister will be on television, making a 1-hour speech on television, announcing the results, going into detail. And this is a very big event. The idea here is this. It's like when you were in school, graduation. People come for graduation, you have the ceremony. So people then take this thing very seriously. The fact that you put the Prime Minister on air and you publish it like that, the ministers sitting out there, they must be wondering for themselves, my God, I don't want to be bottom of the class next year. Because now it's televised. The report is made available to the public. So this really changes behavior. So that is to me, it's a classic example of how you turn something, as you say, you use the word routine, exactly what it is. The annual report, it looks rather benign if you think about it. But when you think of what's behind it, that is a culmination of a weekly routine of the dashboard. And that is a culmination of the weekly problem solving to get that. It's a culmination, like on a concert. You have a concert, but a concert is a culmination of all the practices that the band had before. So that's the routine. So this is how a high-performing organization can drive results.
Yeah. Back to your point, you were quoting the Singaporean minister previously, and he said that there's a line between transparency, nakedness, and pornography. Patrick Lencioni, he suggests that teams need to be very, very transparent, and this is not in the context of annual reporting per se. But he says great teams do not hold back with one another. They are unafraid to air their dirty laundry. They admit their mistakes, their weaknesses, and their concerns without fear of reprisal. And this is from his book, The 5 Dysfunctions of a Team. How much is too much? What do you think? What do you think would be categorized as pornography,
Pornography.
to use that analogy.
I tell you this. This is a conversation I had internally. I had said to them, when it becomes a level that is categorized as pornography, that's when you are exposed to the level of criticism that the organization just cannot take it. And I can tell you this, for 6 years when we did this, there was not once in Parliament that this report was subject of criticism of individual ministers. What do they criticize the government on? Not our report. Every year, the Auditor General internal report is the one that they use to pin down criticism of the government. Because in there, all the weaknesses of the government are exposed. It is not clear what are the corrective actions that will be taken. And in the Auditor General report that looks at areas where they are problematic, it does not give a balanced picture. In our case, we have a balanced picture. This is what we have achieved, this is not what we have achieved, and this is what we're going to do differently. So I think if it had collapsed, let's suppose the criticism was so mounting, and the government was on its knees being criticized by the civilians, and it was unfair to the level that it caused demoralization among the civil service, then we had to make adjustments to it. But as I said to it, let's take it one at a time. So we started at the level of being very, very transparent, and we will scale it up if we believe it has reached a level of being too much transparency and it cannot handle it.
Maybe a helpful way to think about it, and correct me if I'm wrong, but let's say in the report there's the section on what didn't go wrong, what didn't go right rather.
Yeah.
Maybe some areas of where there were arguably failures in terms of inability to meet certain targets, and any other nuances and things that go behind that. Perhaps a way to discern that is what we are putting inside this report, even if it's just very transparent and even if it's slightly damning to ourselves, but is putting it in there, is that going to ensure that we do something about it? Are we putting in these things because actually out of this there's also a recommendation for what can be better versus just simply airing our dirty laundry, as Patrick Lencioni says, not airing dirty laundry for the sake of it or for the sake of causing drama, or even for, there's a big thing now about virtue signaling. People, simply saying things that sound good because that's the flavor of the week, but without really doing it with the right intent. So in this case, I think you can also go down the trap, if you like. And some people do think that annual reporting, publicizing results can be a trap. But I suppose you can go into a trap where you do it for the sake of virtue signaling. Look how transparent I am. Look how vulnerable I am willing to be. But actually, what is the intent of your vulnerability? In a pastoral setting, in a church setting, then this is a question we ask ourselves as well. Because in order for us to be able to support someone pastorally, it usually helps for that person to know that you as a pastor or as a church leader, that you can relate to my struggles and to my pain, because I get a sense that you also either have gone through that struggle, or maybe you yourself are going through a similar struggle, but you have more tools to deal with it. But there's also a point at which if you are to present yourself as so incapable and equally down in the dumps as the person you're trying to support, then that also doesn't help. Because sometimes what happens is that rather than simply being empathetic, you then become sympathetic, which doesn't necessarily help the person out of the pit. So if someone is in the pit, the trap is that you merely sit in the pit with them. without thinking, okay, I'm actually still outside of the pit, but I've actually got a hand stretched out to help you out. Don't go into the pit with the person. Have an arm in the pit ready to pull them out.
Very good. That's a very good analogy. You're right, which we made a reference. The annual report has 3 segments. First segment, the original KPI. Second segment is the performance, the good, the bad, and the ugly. And then the third segment is what we're going to do differently to improve the performance. It is because there are three segments to it. People know that when you put those things out, you come from a good place. Your intentions are good. Because you are now said, this was our true north, we wanted to achieve this. And because you're vulnerable, you show your vulnerability, people accept the fact that, this is an organization, this is a group of people, this is an organization I can trust. And how do they trust? Because the numbers were externally validated. And they know the numbers are not massaged. They're externally validated. In fact, in the annual report, we put clearly that PwC has validated these numbers to be correct, stamp. And it's very important because it provides external veracity to the numbers, and that's very important. So I can tell you, Leon, throughout the year, the ministers know at the end of the year that report is going to come. Anyone who is lagging behind in performance on a weekly basis, because the scores are there, they will intervene in problem solving to improve the performance. Any minister for 365 days, knowing the score is below par, if he or she is prepared to allow it to continue lagging behind it, then the person has to be held squarely accountable for non-delivery to the public. And that's why I've seen in my time there, in 6 years when I was there, I could see on a weekly basis the momentum really improving when one minister, they start asking me the question, how do I fare relative to other ministers? That's what they ask me, because they don't see the performance of other ministers. It's good. I transparently show to them without disclosing who is number one, who is number two. I said this minister one, minister two, the names are there and they know where it's stacked. When they start asking the question, I knew they weren't taking this seriously. So the weekly problem solving become very serious. Very serious. And that you will see that's how a cultural change takes place in the organization. Because they know that report at the end of the year will be published. And they know that the numbers cannot be massaged because it's externally validated. And all along the way, on a weekly basis, they know the score. And so when you start building this routine, everybody, it will drive the performance. And so I was very, very pleased with the work that's being done there.
It's interesting because on the one hand, actually doing this, you could argue that it creates maybe, some people might not like this and they might say, it seems like you're creating a bit of a stressful environment. And that might be true. I mean, I think that is partly why we sometimes perform. I think we do most of us require a degree of pressure or discomfort in order to perform. But I would also argue then that when you generally adopt a posture of transparency, even if that means being very open with your failures, I would argue then actually that is, while it's stressful, it's also a little bit freeing. I think of the verse in John chapter 8, verse 32, that says, then you will know the truth and the truth will set you free.
Yeah.
And that is essentially what we are doing. Yeah. The pursuit of transparency is actually, in effect, the pursuit of truth. And when we are truthful in the way that we operate, even if that means being transparent about failures, it's more freeing to have dealt with the immediate sting of a failure publicly than to deal with the stress of trying to conceal something and trying to continually dress something as better than it actually is. Yeah. That actually becomes more stressful and probably weighs more heavily on you as an individual if you were to choose to go down that path. Yeah. And I've realized this myself because I have, in the past, often been concerned about how I might appear to other people in terms of my performance. And that would sometimes mean trying to do all sorts of things to try to cover up if things went wrong, whether that's in the form of being extra defensive or trying to maneuver ways to cover up for certain mistakes rather than just owning up to them. And things I've seen in the past are, that has caused distrust with previous team members that were under my care. But I think today the counter to that is, as I've tried to become a lot more transparent about these things, you start to realize that it's actually not as bad as you think it's going to be.
Yeah, absolutely.
And also you'll probably realize that people won't even remember. people are more likely to remember things that you have done to cover up because that has a more
Yeah.
long-lasting effect versus if you were to just say, hey, this was really my mistake,
Yeah.
and
It's
you
true.
just apologize and it's
Yeah.
done.
It's done. It will set you free. Absolutely, the truth will set you free. Actually, when you make a mistake, you come quickly clean, and you say, "This is what we have done wrong. This is what we're going to do differently about it." And that was the spirit of what we tried to do. And I was prepared to make correction and corrective action to the process. If it ran to a point we were bringing the organization to a grinding halt, and it was counterproductive, as transparent as we could get. But I realized that it was totally okay. And so we made no change to it. And I was quite amazed. And I thought at that time, maybe it is just here, contextually in Malaysia, that if we do it like that, it will be okay here, but in other countries, it will be not okay. But when it was published, did the same thing in Tanzania, same thing. They were not nailed for the areas they didn't achieve. And because the corrective action were clearly laid out in the report, what we're going to do differently. And the same thing in Oman too. So I think it's contextually, I realized that this idea of being transparent, there's a lot more good than bad. I think we fear the unknown, and we fear things that we cannot nail, we cannot anticipate. So I do believe that the best thing to do is get on and do it, be as transparent as you can get, make adjustments to suit depending on how it is out there. You will only know how painful something hits you if you have a brick hit you against the wall or a sponge hit your face. If a brick hits you, you know it's very painful. If it's a sponge that hit you in the face, you know it's a sponge. So then you will adjust accordingly. And so when we went out today, I realized that it was no problem at all. And so the second year, everybody in the cabinet had no issue with it. The first time, it was a massive problem. It was a massive debate. Why do we need to go and do it like this?
What's your personal biggest public failure? And
Well,
what did you learn from
on
it?
this particular one, there was tremendous. At that time, people were saying, "You guys promised that Malaysia." After I've left, a lot of people are saying, "You guys under the ETP had promised that we'll reach high income nation based on the World Bank definition by 2020. We didn't get there."
What was the World Bank's definition, and where did we arrive?
The World Bank definition, every year, the World Bank puts gross national income per capita in US dollars. This is the threshold. Any country that achieve high income status, the gross national income per capita must be higher than this threshold. So we were saying that we were going to do 10-year work to make sure that we achieve that by the year 2020. I left already in 2016, but there was that ghost, if you like, of non-achievement has carried on for quite some time. But I can tell you, in 2016, in defense of our doing, I did come out and make it very explicit that things within our control, everything we said we were going to do, we did them. And our gross national income went up. In fact, in 2015, if the World Bank had put the ringgit as the measure for gross national income, we would already achieve it. The problem was our ringgit has deteriorated against the dollar because the threshold is pegged in the dollar. So when we started, the exchange rate was 3.2. By the year 2016, it has deteriorated, I can't remember, 3.9 or something like that. So if exchange rate was kept constant against the dollar, we already would have beaten the World Bank threshold in 2015, not 2020, by 3%. And in 2016, we have beaten it by 5%. But this was not within our control. We didn't have any KPIs that was in our control to manage exchange rate. That was the domain of the central bank. They were the one who managed this, and that's a consequence of what was happening on the currency policies, monetary policy that's taken out there. But in life, I talk about divine intervention, Leon. There are many things outside your control. So in my mind, I said I can sleep at night and say that we did everything we could do. The scores were there. The results were clearly out there. We said we will get the private sector to invest 406 billion US dollars. By 2014, it was already 500 over billion US dollars also invested, realized more than the target. So as far as I'm concerned, we did everything we could do. And so when you say the truth will set you free, that's exactly what it is. As far as I'm concerned, the truth sets me free because we did all that we could do within our powers. We achieved our KPIs. There were things outside our control. It's the exchange rate. Interestingly enough, 3 days ago, I was invited by the World Bank to a session here. The economist at the World Bank, Mr. Apurva Singha, he said on stage that Malaysia would have already achieved the GNI per capita, high income per capita, if not for exchange rate. So I went, after I finished talking to him, I showed him the slide that I presented in 2016. He said, wow.
You had that slide
I
on
had
you.
the slide. So I showed him, the analysis, this slide, and he looked at me. Wow, I thought I'm the one who came with that analysis, but you already did the analysis 6 years ago, 10 years ago, or 8 years ago, he said, 8 years ago. And so the point was this, the facts, the truth will set you free. And that, I don't really mind what people say, but in your heart, you know you've done what you could possibly do. And you should relax and say things outside your control, it's okay.
That's a great place to end today's episode. This marks the end of our 8-part series, but by no means does it mark the end of this podcast. This podcast will continue to go on. We will continue to commit to uploading weekly on a Friday at 6 a.m. But this does mark the end of this 8-part series on the 8 steps of transformation. If you want to refer to it, we actually have a playlist on YouTube where all of these episodes have been nicely packaged and consolidated under the playlist BFR 8 Steps. And we just want to encourage you, if this is your first time viewing this podcast, or if you've been watching for a while but you're not subscribed, we implore you to please subscribe to this channel.
And it's totally free.
And it's totally free. Exactly. We encourage you to please subscribe to this channel. It really helps us. It also, the more people that are subscribed and the more we get engagement from you all, to the point on making things public, to the point on criticism and feedback, which we talked about in previous episodes. Your feedback, your engagement really helps us to improve on this podcast and to figure out what's the best format, what are the best topics, what are the sort of conversations that you want to hear. So thank you for your support, and we look forward to bringing you more episodes in the weeks to come. We'll see you next week.